Okay, great. So I want to welcome everyone to our webinar on e-commerce and the impacts of PCI DSS version 4.0 on e-commerce merchants and entities. Yes, maybe I'll start with a short introduction of myself. My name is Tobias Weber. I'm a PCI DSS auditor at USD. We're an independent consultancy with a focus on information security, and basically we offer the entire spectrum from pen tests to security audits and yeah, to basically classic consulting. And yes, I've been a QSA and QPA and generally a IT security consultant for more than 7 years now. I help small businesses as well as big organizations, large organizations. Among them also, of course, e-commerce merchants and service providers with achieving and maintaining their PCI DSS compliance. And of course, as a QSA, I also perform the corresponding audits. Yes, today I want to introduce to you the new PCI DSS version with, of course, a particular focus on e-commerce. If you haven't done so, I highly recommend you to watch the PCI 4.0 Let's Get Started webinar that my colleagues held back in May. You can find it on YouTube, for example, and this will give you a very general introduction to the topic. And today we're really going to focus on e-commerce. With this, we can basically go to our agenda. So we have 3 big chapters today. The first one will be to talk about the timeline of PCI 4.0. Where do we stand right now? What is the outlook for the next couple of years? We will talk about different types of e-commerce scenarios. This to those of you who have already had a more interaction with PCI DSS. This of course refers to the SAQ scenarios, the SAQ architectures, so SAQ A, SAQ EP. Where we want to look at those architectures, and in the new requirements, we will of course also be focusing on exactly these e-commerce architectures that merchants use to find what are the changes that really matter here, and what are the actions that you need to take right now and in the next couple of years. Okay. I think with that, we can go to the next slide. We want to take a look at the timeline. PCI DSS 4.0 was released in March this year, and right now in June, July, the QSA trainings are happening. So all the QSAs need to take an additional training to be able to perform PCI 4.0 assessments. This is particular also because the changes that were introduced with PCI 4.0 are relatively big. They do not only touch the requirements, but they also, to a large extent, touch how the standard itself works. Some of you might have heard about customized approach, which is not really the focus that we have today. But this and similar topics are addressed in the PCI 4.0 Let's Get Started webinar from May 12th that I mentioned earlier. Again, here I recommend you to watch this webinar first. Yes, additionally, the council provided some supporting documentation, including the SAQ, the SAC documents, and the two main dates that we have here is March 31st in 2024. This is the sunset date for PCI 3.2.1, and 31st March 2025. This is the date when the future dated requirements, so all the requirements that are new and that the council has deemed to be significant enough so that a longer transition phase is necessary, when these requirements will get mandatory. So in principle, we have two different transition periods. So the first one is until 1st of April 2024. Until then, you need to be ready to have an assessment according to version 4.0, and until 1st of April 2025. You need to completely implement all the future dated requirements. These dates, 2024, 2025, of course, they sound like they're very far in the future, but if you just think about how quickly the last 2 years have passed, then and maybe it should become clear that these are really topics that you should take into account already now to start project planning, to start evaluating what kind of requirements you have, or what kind of changes are coming up maybe in your own infrastructure independently of PCI DSS, and how this new version will influence that. So that in the end it won't be 2025 and you're hustling to get to fulfill these new requirements, but so that you can have a smooth transition, and really get also the benefit of additional security here, and not only additional efforts that are needed to try to implement some requirements. This also means, I want to stress this again, that PCI 3.2.1 will only remain active and in effect until 31st of March 2024. So after this date, no more PCI 3.2.1 assessments are possible. So this is really the date when 4.0 starts kicking in, and in 2025 it is completely in force. Okay. The other big topic that we have today, where we also should do some preparation, and right now, is the SAQs. So what are these? They're self-assessment questionnaires, and they are essentially an alternative for merchants, but also for service providers in some cases, to get certified according to PCI DSS. So they are basically not new. If you're a merchant, if you've been doing PCI DSS for a couple of years, or maybe only 1 year already, then you probably know them. There are different types. They have these beautiful abbreviations that you see on the slide here. The ones that are particularly relevant for us today are the SAQ-A, SAQ-A EP, and the SAQ-D. These are the ones that are really relevant for the e-commerce payment channel. SAQ-B, SAQ-BIP, SAQ-C, and SAQ-CVT, and SAQ-P2PE are not so relevant. They're for the other payment channels, so for POS and for your motor transactions, mail order, telephone order. So this there will be additional webinars for these kinds of environments, but today we're really going to focus on A, AEP, and D. the SAQs can be completed online. A lot of acquirers have platforms where if you're a merchant that processes with this acquirer, you can log on there, you can fill in your SAQ online, and the platform also assists you in completing the SAQ, and this is really something where that I recommend, because in particular with the new version of the standard, the new versions of the SAQs, of the SAQ forms, it has gotten quite complex, and to avoid formal errors, it is really recommended to do this with the support of a platform. Alternatively, you can of course also download the forms from the PCI Council's website and complete them manually. And maybe as a last note here, but quite importantly, these scenarios. So basically, each one of these SAQs describes a particular environment type that you can have as a merchant. And if you have this type of environment, but you still need to perform a QSA assessment, for example, because you have a very large number of transactions per year, or just because your acquirer demands it, or any other kind of reason, then you can use these scenarios for scoping of QSA assessments too. So then your QSA assessment can be scoped according to what would be in scope of the SAQ, and also be restricted to the corresponding requirements that you have to fulfill to normally complete the SAQ. Okay. Before you complete the new versions of the SAQs, I also recommend you to read very carefully the instructions that come with them. They have been greatly expanded in the new versions. I won't go into a lot of detail here. They basically are largely oriented around the general formal changes that have been made to PCI DSS. So for example, there is the new category for assessing a requirement that is called in place with remediation. If you want to know more about this, I recommend you to listen to the earlier webinar where they go really in depth on this. But this is one example of a change that has been made, and is really explained in a lot of detail in the first parts of these documents. So I can only urge you to read them very carefully. They are, however, not going to be the very focus of our discussions today. What I want to take a look at, though, is the prerequisites for the different SAQs. They essentially, this maybe I can already say, they have not changed a lot. In fact, they haven't changed at all. But I think it makes sense to repeat them so everyone is on the same level and we're all reminded of what we're actually talking about when we later on look at the different controls that have been really changed. So first, SAQ A is really intended for merchants, just like SAQ AEP, for merchants that do not store, process, or transmit cardholder data on their own systems. This is the basically primary prerequisite that you have to fill in any of the SAQs except for SAQ D. And for SAQ A, you have the additional requirement that you need to have an architecture where you normally, if you operate a web server, either have an iframe or a URL redirect, and the end user is forwarded to the payment page of a PCI certified service provider. that performs all the further processing. So basically, your environment does not get into touch with cardholder data at all. You only perform this kind of redirect or implement this iframe, and you do not have a so-called CDE, no cardholder data environment, but really only this redirect and only a web server. In this case, that that impacts the security of cardholder data in some way. There's other scenarios for the SAQ A2 which you could have, but this is, I would say, the most common one, the one that we most commonly see. SAQ AEP is the second largest of the three. So with those, as opposed to the 30 requirements, more or less, that SAQ A has, SAQ AEP has 150 requirements, so it's substantially larger. And here you have a bit more freedom on the implementation of your payment process. One classical example would be to use direct post. Another one would be to have some more freedom regarding the implementation of the payment page. So, for example, if you fill in the SAQ A, then every element of the payment page needs to come from your PCI certified service provider. In SAQ AEP, they can also be provided in parts by you yourself. This is basically the requirements that you have for SAQ AEP, or the prerequisites. And the last one with about 300 requirements, or more than 300 requirements, and the largest amount of freedom regarding implementation is SAQ D. Basically here, no prerequisites apply. One classic example would be some large merchants that maybe offer an API that really process cardholder data themselves, that maybe store cardholder data in a database, and that communicate with the acquirer themselves. And in these scenarios, you would fill in the SAQD and fill in responses to all these more than 300 requirements. With this, we can basically get into the discussion of the new requirements. So in the following slides, I will present first a short overview of the new requirements, and then I will show you some selection of the most important new requirements from our perspective. First, for an overview, there's a total of about of 74 requirements that are new in PCI DSS 4.0, and they're kind of distributed such that the vast majority of them, 62 of these 74, are for merchants and service providers, and there's a lower number of requirements, smaller number of requirements, 12, that are for service providers only. And we also see here that the largest amount of new requirements is mandatory after the entire transition period, so from 1st April 2025, and that a lower number of requirements, 22, is mandatory already from the sunset date in 2024. Basically, as soon as you start working with PCI 4.0, you need to fulfill these 22 requirements already, because they do not have this additional transition time. So we also see here in the table the breakdown for the different SAQ, for the different SAQ scenarios. So in SAQ A, you have a total of 8 new requirements, 5 of which are so-called future dated. So these are the ones that you have to fulfill only in 2025. And 3 of them are mandatory immediately, in quotes, so at the very latest from April 1st, 2024. For the SAQ AEP, you have 24 new requirements, and 23 of them are future dated, with 1 that is immediately mandatory. And for SAQ D, for merchants, so there's 2 SAQ D versions, one for merchants, one for service providers. There's 62 new requirements. This is basically the big one with more than 300 requirements in total. So you also have a large number of new requirements here. Yeah, 43 of those are future dated. Correspondingly, 19 of them are mandatory already from 2024. And in the SAQD for service providers, basically, you have to fulfill the entire standard. So here you have all the 74 new requirements in there, with the 52 that are future dated and the 22 that are impacting immediately as soon as you start assessing according to PCI 4.0. Okay. To get into the requirements, so I will in every slide show you which SAQ the requirement applies to. So for example, here 3.2.1 applies to SAQ A and SAQ AEP. And this requirement is about protection of sensitive authentication data. Sensitive authentication data is basically the new wording for CVV, CVC, CVC2, and so on. All these acronyms that have been that are used here, and the PCI Council decided now to use this term as a shorthand. Yes, they require now that well, basically this is really not so new, that account data storage is kept to a minimum, and that you have data retention policies and disposal policies and procedures. What is new really is that this also applies to sensitive authentication data now. In fact, a lot of organizations have already read this requirement this way. Also, a lot of QSAs already have seen it this way, just because it really does make sense. But the council now really explicitly puts this in here. And this is a new requirement that is also future dated now. So it's only mandatory from 1st of April 2025. And yes, this is this. So basically, for I think most organizations, this one is really not so much of a change, because this is in terms of security also what you should already be doing, really. Okay, the next one is only applicable for SAQ AEP, and of course for SAQ D. So basically all the requirements that I'm going to talk about naturally are in the SAQ D. And this one here is about encryption of data in transit. Here we have 2 new aspects of this. One of them is that the certificates that you use, they should be valid and they should not be expired. So this is something that was not covered in the standard so far, and were something that you already might know from requirement 3 in version 3.2.1. Is that you need an inventory of trusted keys and certificates. This used to be already there in the old version, the current version of the standard, for stored cardholder data. Now you have something similar. for data in transit, and basically what the council wants here is that you have a list and an inventory of these keys and of these certificates, and that you really can manage them better and ensure that only valid and not expired certificates are used. This is a new requirement, mandatory from 1st April 2025. And yes, the purpose is, of course, that the data is protected in transit when it's transmitted over open public networks, such as, for example, the internet. Exactly. Another new requirement is 5.4.1. This is again only applicable to SAQA EP. And this basically tells you that now you should have technical measures against phishing attacks. So also the PCI Council has understood that phishing attacks are in a lot of cases a gateway to get access to environments for criminals, and there should be some processes and automated mechanisms to detect such attacks and to protect the personnel from them. This is again a future dated requirement, so 1st April 2025, and the council also gives in the standards some guidance on the implementation. Basically, the good practice that the council suggests is to use, well, the already, I think, relatively common, technologies, DMARC, the sender policy framework, and domain keys identified mail. These are typically things that for anti-spoofing that you use, that you apply on your or implement on your mail server. What is interesting here is that the applicability notes of this requirement also say that the mail server itself should not, that it's not the intention that the mail server itself gets in the PCI DSS scope with this requirement. So basically here you would be looking at this from really an application point of view. And this should not pull the entire mail server in the scope or even in the CDE. But yes, these are things that you should implement in any case, and now they are also a requirement that you have for PCI DSS, really. The next requirement is that there should be an inventory of third-party software components. So what is meant here is really an inventory of any kind of software or third-party components that are used in development of software. So for example, this would apply to, say, a framework or a library that you're using. And this is relevant for SAQA EP. And also applicable from or mandatory from 1st April 2025. And here basically the purpose is of course that you can address vulnerabilities more easily and really have an overview of all the things that you're using in the software that you develop. For example, in your on your web server, in your payment page, that you really have an overview of which frameworks you're using, and that you can address vulnerabilities here more easily, because this is of course also something that we see again and again in information security, that yes, third-party dependencies can be the downfall of your environment, and yes, addressing vulnerabilities that are known certainly the first step you should be taking, and this gives you the possibility to do this, and this is really what the council has as a focus on this with this requirement. Next, we have a little pre-discussion of a new topic that the council wants to take into account now. This is web skimming. So this is basically a growing threat to organizations that use that receive electronic payments with via e-commerce channels. Essentially, this means that through the use of malicious code, this can usually be roughly categorized in 3 attack vectors. So basically, you have your skimming code and scripts that you're using. You could have some third-party content on your website that contains such code that collects cardholder information, and a third one would be that there's a compromise in your content delivery network. So the classic here would be that you have an S3 bucket that delivers your content, and that has been incorrectly configured, and therefore is vulnerable and has been compromised, that via these attack vectors cardholder data is taken. This has been a growing threat for quite a while. Already in August 2020, there's been a webinar by my colleague Raphael Heinlein, who really explains the topic very well and on a very technical level there. I can only recommend this to everyone. And this is something that the PCI Council now takes into account a lot. So for the SAQ-A and SAQ-E AEP, we have the new requirement to avoid web skimming attacks. And one of them is, or one of the new requirements that address this is that all payment page scripts should be authorized, that the integrity of the scripts should be assured, and that there should be an inventory of those scripts. Again, a future dated requirement. I strongly recommend to take a look at this already and to try to implement these kinds of protections if you haven't already, because the threat is definitely there. Here the purpose is, of course, that that all the scripts that are loaded and scripts from third parties are protected, and these are also the scripts that are impacted by this. So basically any scripts that you're using here. Some words on the implementation. So you should create an inventory of your scripts. Basically, this would be the first step to remove scripts that are not really needed. And then the next step would be to have some kind of process for the authorization of these scripts. So this can be a manual process or maybe an automated process, and this should really be built into the development process that you have already. Then you can use subroutine integrity or content security policy to validate that the script has not been tampered with. So your browser gets the hash value of the script and can verify that. And to limit the locations that the browser can load scripts from and transmit data to, and this would be the more technical part here then to prevent this kind of attack. To move on, not a new requirement for SAQ AEP only here, of course also as SAQ D, is that user accounts and access privileges should be reviewed. And this basically demands that all user accounts need to be reviewed at least every 6 months, and that all application and system accounts, so really your technical users, so to speak, should be evaluated whether the access privileges that they have are in line with principle of least privileges. So whether they have any unnecessary privileges, and those should be taken away from them. And both of these requirements that are kind of connected are of course future dated, because they're new, mandatory from 1st of April 2025. And yes, the purpose is of course to ensure these privilege for these types of account, and to ensure that that the management of these accounts is performed correctly, and that any kind of deviations from these principles can be remediated. In requirement 8.3.6, we have some new requirements regarding password security. So here, finally, the PCI Council, so to speak, has increased the password length from the 7 characters to 12 characters. It's again a future dated requirement. I would consider this already a kind of best practice. Yes, purpose is of course to protect passwords and passphrases from brute force attacks. Further new requirement 8.4.2 is multi-factor authentication. This requirement applies to essentially all access into the CDE. It is already there for service providers, but it is new for merchants from 1st April 2025. And here, basically, you should have multi-factor authentication for all access into the CDE that comes from your organization, and also service providers, so clients, your customers. As a merchant, for example, are not impacted by this. They do, of course, not need multi-factor authentication, at least not from a PCI certification point of view, but this is really intended for any kind of application users and administrators, but not the end user. And the purpose, of course, is that the access to the CDE cannot be obtained by a single authentication factor. So this, to some degree, or yes, is definitely in line with the new requirements that address risks like phishing and similar risks already, and is really just getting on board with what is already considered best practice largely. Here I can also, for implementation and for details on how the council understands multi-factor authentication, I can only draw your attention to the guidance that the council has given. So there's been guidance documentation on multi-factor authentication, and this is very detailed, very situation oriented, and I can only point you to this kind of documentation for further details. Further new requirement is 10.4.1.1. It's basically that your audit log mechanisms or the review mechanisms should be automated. So PCI DSS you've already worked with the standard, you know that that logging naturally is already a requirement, and that you should also be performing a log review already in 3.2.1. But there you still had the possibility to perform this review in a manual process. And now PCI DSS is really demanding that there are automated mechanisms. This simply has the reason that if you have an environment of sufficient complexity, and I think that's not a lot of complexity that is necessary here, it becomes close to impossible for a human to really correlate events and to identify any kind of suspicious activity. And this is really the purpose of this. So suspicious activity and any kind of anomalies should be identified. And this should be repeatable, consistent, and this is really something that you can only achieve if you have some kind of automated mechanism. There's a lot of logging tools that already bring these capabilities and automated rules to the table, and this is something that I definitely recommend you to start using. A good configuration of such tools can be a lot of work, so this is something that you should take into account if this will be a new requirement for you. Then this is something that you should be working on, because it can be quite intricate and quite complex. And yes, of course, when you use such tools, you can the purpose is also to keep them aligned with any changes in your environment, and to periodically review the settings you have there and to update them to really reflect what has changed in your environment. In 11.6.1, we have another requirement that is addressing web skimming attacks. So here again, we have this requirement applicable to SAQ-A and SAQ-AEP. And this says that you should have a mechanism, a change and tamper detection mechanism, to detect changes in HTTP headers and the contents of the payment page. At least weekly or based on some sort of risk analysis. Maybe first the term tamper and change and tamper detection is really a different way to say, in a way, file integrity monitoring or integrity monitoring. This should alert you in case of any tampering with scripts with the contents that you provide to the end user, and yes, to detect any kind of malicious activity that is happening here. A way to implement this is shown on the next slide. Basically, you can try to report any violations of content security policy. You can use some sort of synthetic user monitoring, where you use an automated user to receive the contents of your web page regularly and analyze that for changes that are not expected. It's certainly possible to implement something like this with scripts, and yes, also another or deep basically areas where this should be addressed is your reverse proxies, your content delivery network, and here you could also be looking for changes in scripts that could point to some kind of malicious activity, to some kind of tampering. The details of such an implementation, of course, always depend on the environment and this should be carefully configured, also not to create any unnecessary alerts. If you've already worked with any kind of file integrity monitoring solution, then you probably know this. But yeah, essentially this is something that really should be taken care of. And as I said, now also mandatory in the PCI DSS, of course, as a future dated requirement here. One big change for a lot of merchants, because just because it is a completely new topic in the SAQ-A, is ASV scans. Here the requirement is that you should perform ASV scans quarterly, so every 90 days, at least once every 3 months. And these scans have to be performed by an approved scanning vendor. And this is new for SAQ-A, as I said. An approved scanning vendor, so-called ASV, that's hence the name ASV Scans, is an entity that has been certified by the PCI Council, or certified with the PCI Council, to be able to perform such scans and to implement their requirements on those scans, and they should detect any kind of vulnerabilities in your externally accessible IPs. So any kind of merchant that fills in a SAQ-A and has some kind of web server that is involved in the process of payment. So, for example, a web shop with an iframe or URL redirect would be in scope here. The server would have to be scanned with an ASV scan every quarter by an approved scanning vendor. You can find a list of those ASVs on the website of the PCI Council. Also, USD is of course an approved scanning vendor. But this is a new requirement. I think also one that will impact a lot of merchants, because just so many are using the SAQ-A, and for many entities this already has been a requirement, but it is really new for the SAQ-A. And the purpose is of course that your externally facing devices are scanned for weaknesses, and that you can patch and remediate those. Basically, these are really the devices that are on the internet, and that attackers can reach easily, and therefore this kind of protection from a security point of view is absolutely necessary, and now also a PCI requirement. And these scans are yes, quarterly, and as I said, they are relevant for all systems that are exposed to the internet and that have a direct influence on security. For example, if they perform some kind of redirect or iframe, and also, of course, all systems that transmit, store, or process cardholder data, they are also affected. So essentially all SAQ-A merchants with a web server in their scope have to perform ASV scans. There's a possibility to avoid this, I think. I've seen some implementations using mobile SDKs and a payment link. There's also full service providers that basically take care of this kind of requirement for you. As part of their service, where they maybe offer you a fully fledged payment solution. But I think for a lot of entities, this will be a requirement that they will have to face. In requirement 12.3.1, we have targeted risk analysis. This is a new requirement for SAQ-A and SAQ-AEP. Here we basically have that the frequency for a lot of requirements there where you have to perform some security control regularly is now based on some kind of risk analysis. So you can basically choose how frequently you perform this check. We've already seen this in requirement 11.6.1 with the changed in tamper detection for the HTTP headers that we saw earlier. And purpose is, of course, just to know your own risks and to use controls in accordance with them. Further requirements, security awareness. Security awareness training has already been there for SAQ-AEP. New is that the training should also include phishing and related attacks, or information on them, training on them, and training on social engineering. So these are two new aspects that the council has included here. Makes absolute sense. Both of them are absolutely relevant from a security perspective. If we look at any kind of attacks that are happening in the last years, then this is something that any security awareness training should include. And now the PCI Council, of course, also included them in their requirements for security awareness training. And yes, the purpose is, of course, the technical controls can only limit the number of occasions, but you will never be able to catch all instances of social engineering or phishing attacks, and this really gives the individuals more guidance and more knowledge to respond correctly in these types of situations. So to wrap up our discussion here, I want to give you a short summary of the really most important aspects from my perspective. One of them, of course, the timeline. So really the takeaway here is that from 1st of April 2024, you need to implement PCI 4.0 requirements. And the new requirements, the so-called future dated requirements from 1st of April 2025. For our merchants who use the SAQ-A and SAQ-AEP, we have that the prerequisites for these SAQs are largely unchanged. Only the formulation has been adjusted with the new wording of some aspects from the council side. Yes, again, here I can only recommend you to use a platform, an online assistant to complete these kinds of documents, and to also take good note of the introduction to the SAQs, where there's a lot of information that is really relevant to avoid formal errors. And finally, of course, new requirements. I think the most important ones are 6.4.3, managing your payment page scripts correctly, the change in tamper detection for your HTTP headers that we discussed in requirement 11.6.1, and for SAQ or for SAQ-A merchants, the ASV scans, very impactful change from my perspective. 11.3.2. These are my top three from this list. Of course, you should also take into account all the other ones that are mentioned. Require different environments can really have different needs, and something that can be a small change for one entity can be very impactful and very high effort for another entity. So you should really look at your own environment and and evaluate how to proceed from here. Okay, so with this, I'm finished with the presentation. If you have any questions, then now would be the time. So if there's been any questions, please just let me know or ask away. Okay. Okay. So far, there's no questions. Okay. All right. I think that then we can basically close the webinar here. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and yes, thank you very much. Bye bye.